All right, next up in our series on service workers, we're going to be talking about messaging between clients and service workers. Now, that means sending data between web pages and the service worker. And I do mean web pages plural, because if you remember from previously in the series, we talked about how you could have multiple tabs open, and all of these tabs will be talking to the same service worker. So I can have the service worker decide if it's going to send a message to one of the pages or to all of the pages at the same time. So let's jump in and take a look at that. What I'm doing differently in my web page this time is that I've got this simple little form. I've got a text field and I've got a color picker, and I'm going to be able to type something in here, click a save button, build an object out of that, and then send it to the service worker. In the service worker, we're going to be able to decide, hey, when I receive the message, do I want to send this off to the server to be processed by an API? Am I going to save it inside of IndexedDB, or am I just recording the fact that it's happened and writing it out in the console? So our HTML, you can see that there is just a simple little form. It's got a name field, the color field, and a save button. We've got in the script, there is a function called saveColor. When I submit the form, this runs, and I get those two fields, I get their values, and then I'm going to create an object called person that has three properties: ID, name, and color. The ID is a timestamp, the name and color are those two values, and I'm just going to write it out in the console right now. So just to see that this works, inside of the console, click the save button. Here it is. This is the object. So I'm going to be creating objects like this that I want to be able to send to the service worker. Okay, communication. How does that happen? Well, it's actually fairly simple. Inside of my register service worker, I've got my check to see if the browser supports service workers. If it does, we're registering. We're listening for controller change to see if there's a new version of the service worker we need to listen for. And then we just need to add one listener, navigator.serviceworker.add event listener, and the message, the event that we're listening for is called message. Then I'm going to call my app on message function. That's it. This is now listening for any messages that are coming from the service worker. And every time they do, this function down here, on message, I'm going to write out whatever it was that I received. Now this is an event listener, which means there's an event object being passed in. Inside that, there is a property called data. This is the one that I want to get. So I'm going to use destructuring to say, whatever object is sent to me, the only property I want from that is the one called data. Okay, so there's our message receiving functioning. That's all we really need for that for right now. To send the message, we're going to be using something called postMessage. So I'm going to have this one function that's responsible for doing that. I will call that, and I'll pass in a string, an object, whatever it is. I typically tend to use objects because inside of an object, I can create properties that are like instructions to say, okay, here's the thing that I want the service worker to do, and here is the data for that thing. So I want them to add a person, and here's the person I want them to add. If there was something else to do, we could say, here's the other action that I want you to take, and here's the string that you need to do that thing. So we can create these custom objects, send them to our function, and then we pass that on to the server, as long as it's something that's structured clonable. And that means you can't do things like a function. I can't take a function object and pass that over. I cannot take an HTML element. I can take a string that represents an HTML element, but I can't take the element itself. I couldn't take a reference to an IndexedDB object and pass that over, because that's not something that you could represent in a structured clonable way, kind of like JSON. JSON is structured clonable. Objects that I create, this is structured clonable, because it's something that I could represent as a string. I could make a copy of that way. So the method, we need to check and make sure if we can do this. We need to make sure that navigator service worker. Now in the script that we've got on this page, this is going to exist, but just in case, we want to make sure that that does exist. And if it does, that's it. That's all we have to do. Navigator.serviceWorker.controller, that's the object. Call the postMessage method and pass in whatever the object is that you want to pass over. And that's it. That's our page. We're done. So right now, this is still using the old version of the script. We haven't changed the service worker. If we look inside of our static cache at our JavaScript file down here, and we look into the register service worker, we'll see we don't have right here the listener for onMessage. So this is the old version of the script. When we want to update it, we're going to have to update the service worker version so we get a new version into the cache. So just keep that in mind. All right, so we're sending it. We're ready to receive. We've got our listener added right up here. So we're going to be passing stuff back and forth from the browser side. Now the server side, same sort of idea. Down here at the bottom, we need a send and receive function. So the event listener, just like on the client side, is message. That's the event we're listening for. And we're using self, which refers to the service worker. This whole file. Self add event listener message. Again, there's going to be an event object passed in. And we want to extract data from that. Here I did it the non-destructuring way, and that's just so I could write this out. I want to show what's included inside that event object. So let's change the version number up here. We'll save it to make sure we get the latest version of the JavaScript file coming through. And we'll skip waiting. Okay, now we'll jump over, we'll refresh. And when we save something here, so let's say there we go. There's the save function. And over in the service worker, this is coming from line 149 in the service worker. This is the message event. Quite a bit of stuff in here. There's the data property that we were talking about. Here's all that data that we're passing over. We can open that up and look inside. But in addition to that, I wanted to point out source. There's a source. This window client right here, this window client is the browser, and it has an ID. There is an ID number for every single one of these web pages. So over inside of here, in the other tab, when the service worker writes out its messages, it does so in the console of every single tab that is connected to the service worker. So we're always going to see the message from the service worker here. It's that communication back from the service worker to the browser. That's the one that's going to be different. We can target one tab and have it see that message. But we see all of the messages that are happening in the service worker, regardless of which tab it is. Right here, here's the ID. So it starts with 220B. And on this page, if I were to put something else in, and we pick a different color, save it. Oh, this one needs to be refreshed. We need to have the latest service worker. So 730D, that is this web page, this tab. And over here, we see both messages. The one that came from this page, which had the source as 220B, and the second one, 730D. So they both have unique identifiers, both tabs, so that we can see them. All right, so we're going to come back and we're going to use that information. Let's comment that out. All right, so I have the data that came back. Now, let's just write out a message here saying that we got the data. This is inside the service worker. And we can say data, that's what we got. And I can also get from here that client ID. So let's make a variable for that. ev.source.id. That is the client ID. Keeps changing it on me here. Okay, there we go. All right, so we're going to get the data that came over. We're going to get the client ID, so we'll be able to see that coming up instead of getting the whole event object being written out. Now, as I was talking about before, over here, having those instructions like, this is the thing that I want you to do. So I can say in here, if add person, if that property exists inside the data object, that's the task I'm supposed to carry out. If other task, I think it was, or other action in data, here's the thing that we want to do. So we can decide whatever it is that we want to do based on these actions that are inside the object. My message that I'm going to send, let's say it's thanks. Pretend I did something with the data. All right, so two different things I could do here. One, I'm going to pretend I did something with the data. If add person came in, let's say I got the ID, we saved it in an IndexedDB, or we sent it off with fetch to some API. Great, we did that. We can also do things inside of our messages, like we could turn those into objects. Instead of just the message, we can indicate whether or not there was a problem. So we could send back an error code. If code is 0, there was no problem. And there's the message. We do the same thing up here. Instead of just message, let's create an object, and we'll report back on the success or failure. We could include an error message there. This message could be a good or bad thing, and depending on whether code is 0 or some other number, we know whether or not something worked. Okay, so I've got those two different approaches, or two different tasks, depending on whether or not properties existed inside of there. Both times I'm going to send back some message to the client. And this first one, I'm including a client ID as the second parameter. In this one, I'm not passing a client ID. Down in my send message function, I'm going to take the message and then an optional parameter that I'm calling client ID. Now, I can choose at this point if I'm going to send it to everything or just one of the tabs or windows that are connected to my service worker. So I'm going to create an array of all the possible clients. Just back like, I think it was in the third or fourth video in the series, I was talking about clients.claim. Clients refers to all of the windows and tabs that are talking to the service worker, that the service worker is controlling. Well, we're going to create an array of those client objects and say, you know what, if you've passed me a client ID or you haven't passed me, that's how I know whether I want to send it to everybody or just one. So let's say my client, I'm going to use await. This is why I've made it an asynchronous function, so I can use await here. The client's object, beyond just claim, we also have a get method where I can pass in a client ID. So that string that was coming, oh, it's gone now. The string that was coming from the browser, that client ID was a big long string, unique identifier. That's what we pass into clients.get. Then I'm going to push that into my array. we go. And if we don't have one single client ID, I'm going to say all of the tabs, all of the clients. So we're going to match all. And this is an options object that we can pass in to say, do I want to include the ones that are sort of in a pending state? They haven't grabbed hold yet of the latest controller. Yes, we do want to include those. Then I'm going to return, and I'm going to use promise.all. If you haven't worked with that before, there's a link up there to my video on promise.all and how that works. Basically, we can pass in an array of promises, and it will give us back an array of answers. So all clients.map, we're going to create a map of clients, or we're going to extract from the all clients array all of the clients. So each one of the clients, let's write out a message here. There we go. Now the client object itself, this is the same as that source object that we had up here, the event source. This is a client, so there's an ID property. Down here, our client is going to have the ID, that's that string, so we can say who we're sending it to, and we're looping through this array of clients. So if it's sending it to 2, we should see 2 of these messages. If it's sending it to 1, we should see 1. And then we have to return an array of promise objects, and client.postMessage will do just that. There we go. So we'll save that. And now we should have that full lifecycle working. So I've got there we go. We've got 1. Oh, we need to activate it, of course. So skip waiting. All right. Start again. All right, so we're going to save Crowley with the color black. Here is the service worker is reporting back that it received our add person with the object, and there is the client ID. This is the tab right now. And every time you refresh your page, you're getting a new unique identifier for your client. Don't rely on this being the same for a tab for any length of time, because every time it refreshes, it's a new version. So post message. This is inside that map loop. We're posting this message, and there we go. There's the 2 of them. So we passed through add person and other action. So the add person sent 1 back to this tab, and then other action sent that message to both tabs. And then back in app.js, that's the app.js connected to this web page, we're getting both of these messages right here, the one for the add person and the one for the other action. So both of those came back. Now, if I come back to the console over here, okay, the service worker saying, yeah, I got it. Service worker saying, yeah, let's pretend I did something with the data. The service worker is reporting that it sent out the OLA to 2 tabs. But when we come back to our script, the only thing we see is just this 1 message that came back to me. I'm not seeing the message. This script is not running the message to say, hey, I received something from the service worker about the add person message. You can see over here, web page receiving, it got 2. This tab got 2. This tab only got the 1. You can do that again from this one. So let's refresh both of them so there's nothing in either console. So we'll send that over, and service worker received the add person, the other action. It wrote out all 3 of these. These are the 3 messages that it was transmitting. And this tab received back 2, web page receiving 2 of them. Over here, service worker for all 4 things again, but only 1 thing was received by this page. And that's because I was sending data that triggered 2 actions. if we changed our script right here, so if we weren't sending both add person and other action, we can see, let's remove this temporarily. And we'll have to change the cache. So update the cache. There we go, up to version 4, so we have the latest version. Let's refresh to clear out. Refresh to clear it out. Now, in the script, from the page, all we're doing is add person. So only the one page should receive it, the page that's sending it. The consoles will both show all of the messages in the service worker. And actually, we could, if we wanted, just for argument's sake in here, let's comment out all of the console log messages that we have in our service worker. That way, so skip waiting. Yep, they're both up to date. Refresh each tab. Everybody's got the latest version of everything. Back to the console, back to the console. Now, an add person, the only messages I should see here are the ones that the script on this page are generating. So the, hey, I'm going to save a person, I'm sending a message, I'm receiving a message, but all of the messages should be from my script. There we go. So saving, I sent it to the server, to the service worker, and I received back something. Over here, nothing happened because my page is, it's like my page is oblivious. It does not know that this is going on. Same thing over here. If I pick and save something, there we go. I get the message back from the service worker, but this page doesn't. And that's because I sent a client ID. And the client ID came from this message event where I was able to get the ID. So if I have the ID, then I can get a single client and send a message to them. If I don't have a client ID, I just match to everybody and I broadcast to all of the pages that are connected. All right, and that's it. That's sending messages. That's the clients. That's how they work. Hopefully that all makes sense. If you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments. A copy of this code is linked to in the description. And as always, thanks for watching.